Hello, good evening. Good evening. Now, let me start. In the last class, that was uh, the last virtual class, we started with, we ended Coleridge's chapter 14, where we discussed the difference between poem and poetry, the function of poetry, Coleridge's idea about organic unity of poetry. And after that we discussed Wordsworth's view on his choice of rustic themes, his choice of rustic language, and his ideas about the diction of poetry. And we said, and we planned that in this class we will discuss how Coleridge criticized Wordsworth's ideas and his reasons for his choice of rustic themes as a theme of his poetry, and his choice of rustic language, and Wordsworth's idea about the diction of poetry. So in this class we will deal with two things, that is Coleridge's criticism on Wordsworth's theme of poetry, Wordsworth's choice for the theme of his poetry, and Wordsworth's ideas about rustic language, how Coleridge criticized Wordsworth's selection of themes and his ideas about rustic language. Now, Coleridge started his criticism with Wordsworth's choice of the theme of poetry, and he criticized from the very first statement that Wordsworth did the choice of rustic characters and life. Regarding this, Wordsworth's choice of rustic characters and life, the reason behind his choice, Coleridge points out, the first thing that he pointed out is that not all Wordsworth's characters are chosen from low and rustic life. That all the Wordsworthian poets are not dealing with characters, have not those characters which come from the low and rustic life. Just like the characters we find in the poem Ruth, Michael, the brothers, these characters do not belong to the low and rustic rung of the society in the usual acceptance of those words. And secondly, he said that the first point is all the characters of Wordsworth's poets are not from the low and rustic life. And the second thing that is very important, he says that their language and sentiments which we find in the characters, that the language that the characters are using, or the poem is using the language to describe those characters, or the characters are speaking in that language, the language and the sentiments, they do not necessarily arise from their abode means where they are from, or from their occupation. So the language they are using, what Wordsworth said, that my language will be the language of the low and rustic people. He says that some of his poems have certain characters where we find that their language has no connection with their abode, means from where they originate, and from their occupation. And he says that these language and the sentiments that these characters have, they are attributable to causes which would result in similar sentiments and language, even if these characters were living in a different place and carrying on different occupation. He says that if, suppose a particular poem has characters in Wordsworth's poem, and Wordsworth says that the characters are speaking in a specific language, and the sentiments the language actually express, the particular style and the particular nature of the language and the sentiments the language express, all these are connected to or associated with the place from where they originate and the occupation they are in. But Coleridge says that this is not true, because there is no innate and intricate relationship between the abode and origin of the language and the sentiments that the characters are speaking in Wordsworth's poem. Okay. He says that if you change the abode and occupation of the characters may have the same quality in their language, and that their language will express same type of sentiment, because there is certain other things, certain other attributes in that language which has been chosen, which the result of which is that particular sentiment or this particular nature of language. He says that he says that their language and sentiment, they are attributable to causes which would result in similar sentiments and language. Well, he says that these characters, if will speak similar language and can express similar sentiments, if their abode and their occupation can be changed, because it has certain specific characteristics in them, which is why the language and the sentiments that the characters speak and express are same. It is not because of their language and their sentiment of those characters are like this, what they are in the poem, are not because of the origin from where the characters emerge or the occupation they are in. He says, different occupation. He says, now Coleridge points out that what are these causes that Wordsworth had says? These causes are primarily two. And what are they? Independence. These characters are independent, which raises a man from servility. The man is not servile to anything. The man is not subordinated to anything. The character is independent, and a frugal and industrious domestic life. The man is independent and it is not servile, and it is a frugal means where there will be lack, where there will be prosody, there will be want. Okay, poor. Frugal means poor. An industrious domestic life. One. And the second thing is a solid religious education. Now we will find that the characters with which Wordsworth is dealing, these characters are not exactly or not only from a very rural rustic and low life, but these characters, on the contrary, they have a very solid religious education. And what is that? Which makes a man well versed in Bible. So the characters in Wordsworth's poem, we find that these characters are very much aware of the things that are there in Bible. They are associated with Bible and the language that the book uses and other holy books, to the exclusion of other books. That these characters are more exposed to the holy books like Bible, for which they have a special type of sensibility in them, which has been wrongly pointed out by Wordsworth as these characters are very simple and their language is also very simple, because they are very much close to, associated to, with a low and rustic life. Coleridge says that this is not true. This is not true. Their simplicity in language and their simplicity in sentiment is not because of their low and rustic life, but because of their independence, which resists them from being servile to something. They have a very simple life. And second of all, that is very important, that is, these characters are well exposed to religious books and ideas that we find in the Bible and similar books, and not other types of books. So there is a influence of the language, the philosophy, the style, the simplicity that we find in the religious books like Bible, which characterizes the characters of Wordsworth's poems. The admirable qualities, she says, the admirable qualities we notice in the language and sentiments of Wordsworth's poems result from these two causes. What are those causes? One is independence, which their characters have independence, which raises a character above servility. And the second is they are exposed to a solid religious education that we find in holy books like Bible. So he says that these two causes give or add certain admirable qualities in the language and sentiments of the characters of Wordsworth's poem, and not from their rural or life and occupation or their contemplation of nature. Even if, so Coleridge says that even if these characters lived in a city which is far away from nature, which sometimes is taken as an opposite to nature, they would have similar sentiments and similar languages. So he says that the rural setting or the low and rustic life is not the important factor for which the characters of Wordsworth speak in a very simple language, and they express simple sentiments. He says that if these characters have been taken to a city life in an urban space, these characters would have that same simple language and sentiment, because the causes are different. The causes are that independence which raises them from servility, and two is their exposure to a solid religious knowledge which comes from their association with Bible and other holy books. Okay, so he says that it is not the rural setting which is important. If they were subject to the two causes mentioned by Wordsworth, then if these two causes are there, if these two characteristics characterize these characters, if these two characteristics are found in the characters of Wordsworth's poem, that is because of that two particular causes, their independence and their exposure to a solid religious knowledge. Now, in the opinion of Coleridge says what? A man will not be benefited from a life in rural solitude. So he says that rural solitude is good, but in order to get something out, something good from a rural life, what you need for that, unless he has natural sensibility and suitable education. So Coleridge says that you can get something good out of a rural life when you have a natural sensibility, you are sensible, which is very much innate to your nature, which is something which comes from deep within you, and a suitable education, that is important. So you need a sort of training to gain something out, to gain something from the natural rural life. Otherwise, he says that rural life will be detrimental to the simplicity of the character. In the absence of these advantages, Coleridge says that if this particular sensibility, a natural sensibility and suitable education is not present in a character, in rural condition, the character's mind hardens, and he says that the mind hardens, the mind becomes hard. If the mind lacks sensibility, the mind will become hard, and it will no longer remain simple and sensible. It will become hard, and the man will grow what? Coleridge uses the word selfish, sensual, one who is very much controlled by the senses, selfish, sensual, gross, and hard-hearted. So Coleridge uses this, that if a character, even if the character comes from a rural background or a rustic and raw life, Coleridge says that he will fail to express the simple attitude, his simplicity as in his language and in his sentiment, if the character lacks the natural sensibility and suitable education. Then the man who is from the character which is from a rural and rustic life will have a heart which is hardened, selfish, sensual, gross. Coleridge agrees. Now Coleridge here takes the cue from Aristotle. He cites Aristotle's view that the characters of poetry must be, now please note it down, that the characters of poetry must be universal and typical. A character of a poetry must be universal. So if there is any kind of individuality in a particular character in poetry, that individuality in that character will add to the collective characteristics of a group of characters. Okay, so he supports Aristotle's view that the characters of poetry should be universal and typical. That means they must, he says that they must represent some particular class. So a character in a poetry must be representing a class, a group of people, as well as general human nature. No, not just any individual human nature, but a general human nature. Now Coleridge writes, poetry, please note it down, poetry is essentially ideal. Poetry is essentially ideal, that it avoids and excludes all accident. Poetry is essentially ideal, comma, that it avoids and excludes all accidents. If there's an accident, there will be a difference. An accident means what? An accident only proves or acknowledges or establishes a general nature of the thing. So it must be something typical. It must be something, there must be something typical in a particular thing. Now if there is an accident, it shows that there will be a certain change, a certain disruption. That change or disruption only proves the general nature of the thing. Okay, so he says that poetry should avoid and exclude all accident. Okay, it should be ideal. And then he says that its apparent individualities, of rank, character or occupation, that the apparent individualities of a particular rank, a particular character and occupation, that is very important. He says must be representative of a class. So a particular character in poetry is just a part of that universal thing. It must be a part of the class. So a character in poetry should be ideal and universal. That means there will be there will be no accident or no change. There will be a typicality in it. Okay, representative of the class, and that the persons of poetry must be clothed with, means the person of a poetry must have generic attributes. Generic means it should have something which belongs to the genre where the particular individual exists. So whatever the character express as its characteristics, just like rank, class or anything, that must be a representative of the genre where it exists actually. Must be clothed with generic attributes, with the common attributes of the class, not with such as one gifted individual might possibly possess. So there is no such thing which is important or which is recognizable individually in a particular character. Whatever the character express or whatever the character has as its characteristics should be or must be a part of the general category of the general characteristics of a particular category or genre. It is always representing a particular class or a genre. And he says that Wordsworth's characters are representative in this sense. What is that sense? That all Wordsworthian characters, Wordsworth will say that, what did Wordsworth say? That Wordsworth said that my characters have been chosen from a rustic and rural life because these characters are very simple. Why they are simple? Because they speak in a very simple language and they express simple sentiment. And why that is very simple, both their language and sentiment? Because they come from the rural setting or they come from a rustic life. Coleridge says that Wordsworth himself has described his characters originating from a rural and rustic life. This is not always true, because there are some characters there are some characters which do not belong to the rural and rustic life, like the characters we find in Ruth and Michael and brothers, etc. He gave some names, and then he said that the characteristics, the original characteristics of this language and sentiment of those characters are not related to their rural setting or rustic life where they were actually posited, but their root lies in a different thing. They speak in a simple language and they express simple sentiment, not because of their rural setting or their not because of their rustic life or the place from where they originated, that is a rural setting. It is not that. He says that this is because these characters speak in a simple language and they express simple sentiment because they have a sort of independence which raises them from a servile and frugal life, and second, they are exposed to a solid religious education which expose them to holy books like Bible. Now these two characteristics actually are the things, or these two factors are actually functional functional for Wordsworth's characters to speak in a simple language and express simple sentiment. And then Coleridge establishes this thing by saying that now all the characters of poetry, they are universal and ideal. So we cannot categorize Wordsworth's characters into two parts, that one characters which belong to the rustic life and other characters which don't belong to the rustic life. It is not like that. These characters actually originate from a particular class, which class is not the rustic and rural class, but these class can be characterized by two factors or two things. One is these characters enjoy a sort of independence, and two is these characters are exposed to a solid religious education for which they speak in a language which is very simple, and they express sentiments which are also very simple. Now he criticized Wordsworth's ideas and established Wordsworth's characters from a different parameter with the help of Aristotle's idea. Clear? Regarding rustic language, this is the second point, and this will probably the end point. Now after this we will end the class after this point. Regarding rustic language, Wordsworth says that as regards the second statement of Wordsworth about the Wordsworth's discussion on rustic language, Coleridge objects to the view that the best part of language is derived from the objects with which the rustic hourly communicates. Now here Wordsworth says that the language that I used in my poetry, that the best part of that language actually is derived, the best part of that language is derived from the objects with which the rustic hourly communicates. He says that the rustic people most of the time communicate with certain simple objects, and the language, the best part of the language that I used in my poetry is actually a result of that. When the rustic characters, they communicate with some simple and rural objects, the best part of their language comes out, and Wordsworth says that I have used that language. Now what was Coleridge's point? Communication. Coleridge says that communication with an object. So when I am trying to communicate with language with an object implies reflection on it. So when I am communicating with an object, that means I am reflecting on it. Suppose I am communicating with a particular person, that means I am talking to that person. So when I am speaking to that person or talking to that person or interacting with that person, what I am doing, actually I am reflecting on him. I am trying to understand what he or she is actually trying to understand from what I say, and how he or she is reacting to what I am saying or reacting to my stimuli. Okay, when I am talking to you, that means I am trying to understand how you are reacting to what I say and how you are understanding that. That means I am reflecting. So when a person is communicating, when a person or thing is communicating with a particular object, there is a sort of reflection happens, that an object implies its reflection on it. And he says that, and the richness of a vocabulary, the use of words, the vocabulary, the richness of the vocabulary arises from such reflection. Because I am reflecting on you, I can understand what you are thinking and how you are reacting, or how you can react, or how will you be acting after this kind of communication. That means the more I am understanding you, the more I will enrich the words with which I can better understand you. So it enriches the vocabulary of my language. The more I am reflecting on you, the more I am understanding you, and more I will be enriched. My vocabulary will be enriched while I am trying to understand or reflect on you. So he says that communication with an object implies reflection on it. So okay, this is fine. And the richness of the vocabulary enriches when the richness of the vocabulary arises. It arises from such reflection. The more the enriched is reflection, the vocabulary will be more enriched. Now Coleridge says, now the rural conditions of life do not require any reflection. So when I am in a rural setting, or the rural conditions in life, they are very simple. That is very straight lined. There is no certain complexities, no complexity in it, for which you need to reflect on the thing, because the conversation is very, not just simple, but it is simplistic. Now the rural condition of life do not require any reflection. Okay, hence the vocabulary of the rustics is poor. When I said that communication needs reflection, and more there is reflection, more there will be the enrichment of vocabulary. Now Coleridge says that in rural life, the conversation lacks any kind of reflection. There is no requirement of reflection, and because there is no reflection, the vocabulary is not rich, that is poor. They can express only the barest facts of nature. This is Coleridge's view. There may be some different views, many people can differ, but this is Coleridge's view while he is criticizing Wordsworth. He says that they can express only the barest facts of nature. So he says that these rural people are less philosophical, they are less reflective, so they can only express the barest things that they see around, that they can only describe, they cannot analyze, they lack that analyzing power. Okay, they do not require any reflection, hence the vocabulary is poor. And he says that they can express only the barest facts of nature and not the ideas and thoughts. So what Coleridge wanted to mean, I may differ, I may have a different opinion on this, but actually here I am not talking of my own ideas, but actually I am pointing out what is Coleridge's ideas while he is criticizing Wordsworth's views. So he says that the rural life can only express the barest facts of nature and not the ideas and thoughts. That he says that rural conversations requires no exchanges of ideas and thoughts. Universal laws which result from reflection of such facts. So he says that they lack any kind of ideas and thoughts. That's why their language is not enriched. Their vocabulary is not enriched. They speak in a very bare, poor, straight language. Secondly, the best part of a man's language, he says that the best part of a man's language does not result merely from communication with nature. He says that the language, you can, if you only communicate with nature, your language will not be enriched only. That only your communication with nature can enrich your language. But from education, he says that education is important to enrich your language. This is a very common thing, you all know. If I only interact with nature, if I don't go to school, if I don't have no lessons on grammar and language and everything, how can I enrich my vocabulary? How can I enrich my language? That is a very common thing. This is okay. The language does not result merely from communication with nature, but from education, from the mind's dwelling on noble thoughts and ideas of the mastermind. So we always say that if you want to have a good command over language, you should read good books, or books written by good scholars. We always say, we always recommend that you should read good theory books, and writers who have written in a very good, lucid, but very what to say, a very language which has an in-depth explorative quality. Okay, so we always say that. So Coleridge says that only your communication with nature won't help you to enrich your language, but what you need is education and your exposure to good or novel thoughts and ideas of the masterminds of humanity. So you need to read good books, good philosophical books, good books on sociology, political science, history, and natural science, and many things. The more you read, the more your language will be enriched. That is what Coleridge says. Whatever noble and poetic phrases, words and arrangements of words the rustics use are derived from nature. He says that a rustic person who is not exposed to proper or quality education, or who is not, or who are not exposed to good books, they derive their acumen of language, their quality of language, they derive their power of language from nature, but from repeated listening to the Bibles and to the sermons of noble and inspired preachers. So he says that Wordsworth mistook that as a fact that the rustic people, their language is something different and their language has an enriched vocabulary. He says that it is not because they are closely associated with nature, but he says that these people, they may not have read good books, or they may not have been exposed to good philosophy and ideas and thoughts, but they are exposed to Bible when they go to church. So through Bible they have been exposed to good ideas. What Coleridge says, as they repeated listening to the Bibles and the sermons of noble and inspired teachers. So Coleridge says that their enrichment of vocabulary is because of their exposure to Bible and some such holy or religious books, which they get the chance to listen when they go to church and attend the sermon classes. Okay, so these are the 2 points that Coleridge said about Wordsworth's idea of rustic language and Wordsworth's idea about the themes of poetry. Is it clear? I will take one more class for 2 points. That is the third point of this section, that is Coleridge's criticism on Wordsworth's poetic diction, and the last thing is Coleridge's idea about the willing suspension of disbelief. So one long class I will take for these 2 things, and then we will finish Coleridge, and after that we will start Shelley. In Shelley we will do, that is defense of poetry. Okay, the defense of poetry that we will do, and after that, if I get time, we will start that is Prometheus Unbound. Now till then, okay,